Thank you all for coming. Welcome to my talk, welcome to OCON, and I'm very grateful that you came here to hear me. It doesn't look as if I'm getting introduced by anyone else, so I, as an individualist, be happy to introduce myself. I'm Shoshana Milgram, and I think of myself as sort of the Austin Heller of this operation, because as you remember, in the Fountainhead, Austin Heller's job was to see greatness and say so, and that's what he did for Howard Roark. And I'm here to do that, not just today, all the time, to see greatness and say so when it comes to Ayn Rand. And today my particular subject has to do with Frank Lloyd Wright and the Fountainhead, and to give you, in an hour, as much as I can of the full story. Now, the thing about the Fountainhead, we're here at 75 years, and the questions have gone on for about 75 years of who really is the model for Howard Roark? What is the relationship between Howard Roark and Frank Lloyd Wright? Was Howard Roark inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright? What's the connection between the fictional hero and the actual architect? So I'm actually going to cut to the heart of the matter here. The answer to the question about whether Roark was based on Wright is no and yes, but not in the same respect. And I'll explain that. The reason why the answer is both no and yes is that Ayn Rand was writing a novel about an architect whose career exemplified independence, individualism, and integrity. And that was her plan, and from her reading, she inferred that the architectural career of Frank Lloyd Wright exemplified independence, individualism, and integrity. So, in planning and composing her novel, she drew on what she had learned about his work. So, it would be wrong to say that she developed all of the Fountainhead without knowing anything about Frank Lloyd Wright. That would be wrong. However, the characterization she created, Howard Roark, her ideal man, was a full-time, all-purpose hero in all episodes of his life and in all stages of his life. Howard Roark's life was consistent with the virtues that were present in his buildings. And for that characterization, she drew on what she knew about the human ideal and on the moral code appropriate for the ideal man. In creating Roark, she did not consider Frank Lloyd Wright's moral conduct or the events of his life in any episodes outside his career. In creating Roark, she did not consider Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas in any field outside architecture. So it would be wrong to say that she created Roark in the moral and intellectual image of Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay, so that's why we've got, no and yes. And I will add, and you will hear later on, that his own remarks about the Fountainhead and about Ayn Rand show us, in case we had any questions, that he was not Howard Roark. But we'll get to that later. We're going to start at the beginning with her written plans for the Fountainhead, beginning in December 1935. And she got the idea for what she called Secondhand Lives much earlier from a neighbor of hers in Hollywood, but her first written plans are from December 35, and they deal primarily with the novel's theme and characters, not with architecture. So when she's writing down her first plans, she's got the characters, who they are, what they mean, and what the principles are. Architecture comes later. So the question might be, why did she choose to deal with architecture? Because this was, Secondhand Lives doesn't say architecture. The ultimate title doesn't say architecture. Why did she choose to deal with architecture? And here's her answer. And by the way, I like to, quote exactly if I can. In this case, I really do want to get Ayn Rand's words just as she wrote them. Was my choice motivated by any previous knowledge of architecture or architects? No. When I made my first notes for the Fountainhead, I knew almost nothing about architecture. I chose it deliberately as the background best suited to my thesis. A builder is one of the most eloquent representations of man's creative faculty. Okay? So that's her explanation for why architecture, and she knew what she wanted the book to be, and then she had to research the architecture. As she began her research, she developed a strong interest in Frank Lloyd Wright. She had barely known his name. She'd seen a few pictures of his buildings. She'd known some buildings out in California, but she did not plan for this to be the novel of Frank Lloyd Wright. Part of studying architecture for her was to follow a reading list, and it was prepared just for her in March of 1936, so that's after her first written notes, by a librarian at the New York Public Library. And if you're interested, by the way, her name is Jennie Flexner, and I can tell you more things about her. She was an amazing person. Thank you, Jennie. Okay, but Jennie Flexner made up this list for her. Ayn Rand thought it was a very good list, and we saw that she got right to work. And from her notes, we can see that she started reading very soon about Frank Lloyd Wright. It appears that an early source of information was his autobiography, first published in 1932. And I should mention that if you intend to read this, you should read the edition published in 1932, which is the one she read, because afterwards he included some material that would have, she said, if she'd read that, she would not have sought him out personally. Just saying, so 1932. And she read that, and she made note of his architectural principles, of his architectural practices, and of his statements about clients and about the architects and critics who attacked him. And I've got a few examples here of some of the pieces of that work that she noticed. And I think that they'll sound somewhat familiar to you, or at least consonant with what you know. Here's a conversation between the young Frank Lloyd Wright and a fellow architect, Corwin, who worked by his side in the early days. Corwin said, "But whom are you going to build homes for?" Frank Lloyd Wright responded, "I won't need but one man in 10,000 to work for. Even one man in 100,000 would keep me more than busy all my life, because that man will need me as much as I need him. He will be looking for me." Now, Ayn Rand's form of that, of course, is much more succinct. Chapter 1, Part 1, "Those who want me will come to me." Okay, so this is something that she read in Wright that fit with her idea of Roark, and obviously it's a similar point. We actually see her making note of a comment that Wright made when he heard that young architects sometimes feel that they need to sell out because they have to live. And Frank Lloyd Wright wrote down, and she noticed this, "I don't see why anyone has to live, at any rate not live as a parasite at the expense of the thing he loves." Chapter 13 in the Fountainhead, Austin Heller, "After all, you have to live." Roark replies, "Not that way." Right. So you can see that there's a similarity of approaches. Also that Ayn Rand is much more eloquent and succinct than Frank Lloyd Wright, although he's not bad. For an architect, he writes pretty, this is not his specialty, he writes well enough. Years later, though, she remembered what her impressions were of the book, both positive and negative, and here's what she said. "I could agree with, see the logic of, and admire very much his architectural ideas, to the extent to which I could see past his formulations. And also, he sometimes expressed himself very clearly on architecture. But I violently disagreed with all the rest of his ideas, particularly political and philosophical, because he was quite loosely collectivistic in some undefined sort of way, besides which enormous touches or implications of mysticism." And as you know from the Fountainhead, she didn't use any of that. Okay. During the research process, in addition to reading the books from Jennie Flexner's list, she worked without pay as a filing clerk and typist for Eli Jacques Kahn, a New York architect. And I've always liked that story. She went to his office and she noticed the filing system was inefficient, so she fixed it up. Later on, she helped us out with epistemology, right? So, same principle. So she apparently did very well with that, and everyone was pleased. But, of course, her real job was to observe what he was doing in architecture and to read what he read and to talk to him. She observed practical details of the business, and she took notes on additional texts by and about architects. In November 1937, she took notes on a 1934 publication, and it included an editorial by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'm going to read you from that, what she noted. "There is probably no great society where individual possession is not something to be respected and encouraged." So connection between greatness and individual possession. "Nor is there a society worth considering where individuality is not the desirable cultural product of human life." So, again, praising individuality. And then there's this paragraph, which she marked with a check in the margin of her notes. The natural man, the natural way, is no longer the desirable way. Manpower itself is becoming vicarious. Culture itself, a vicarious atonement. Academic education in its stead, destroying native powers. Criticism takes the place of creation. Life is more and more a vicarious matter of subsisting existence. Therefore, life is no longer really living. And I've left out a few bits, but those are important words, and she marked it down. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, does anybody recognize it? Have you run into it? Well, you got to go back to the letters of Ayn Rand, because this passage appeared in the very first letter she wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright. It first appeared in print in this editorial in the short-lived publication Taliesin, and this editorial has never been reprinted in his collected works. I was able to figure out what it was and to locate a rare copy at Northwestern University, and thus to verify the quotation, because she quotes it, and I assume she got it from someplace, and then I found it in her notes, and then I found it at Northwestern. But you will not find it anywhere on the internet or anywhere else in print other than the original publication and Ayn Rand's quotation in the letter that she wrote not long after she read it. Okay, so she wrote that letter. And now I want to go back to Taliesin and something else she learned from that issue. She also copied down the following, and she's quoting, "And then I wish both mill and gravel heaps, endlessly subject to my will." And she writes down in her notes, "There is a definitely Roark emotion." Okay, so in other words, she already knows what a Roark emotion is, and she sees this in writing, and she thinks, good stuff. And you might remember this from some of her other notes. She says, oh, this is going to be good for Toohey. Okay, so she knows who the characters are, and then she sees counterparts, and she makes notes. Also, she wrote down, this is, again, quoting from Wright, "Gold and silver, lead and copper, tawny iron ore, all lying in drifts to yield themselves up to roaring furnaces and to flow obedient to the hand of the mastermind." You see, she already knows who Roark is. She knows what a Roark emotion is. She doesn't learn about Roark from observing Wright. She decides that Wright is worth her attention because he reminds her of her Roark. And I'm sure you remember from the opening chapter, these rocks, he thought, are here for me. And there's more like that. So, that's Roark, and she sees it in Wright, and it's one of the things she likes about Wright. So, within a few months of reading this material, she writes a letter to Wright. And she mailed it to him at Taliesin, his home in Wisconsin, and I'm going to quote from that letter. She described her plan. "My new novel, to put it very briefly and dryly, is to be the story of an architect who follows his own convictions throughout his life, no matter what society thinks of it or does to him. It is the story of a man who is so true to himself that no others on earth, nor their lies, nor their prejudices can affect him and his work. A man who has an ideal and goes through hell for it." She told Wright, "His story is the story of human integrity. That is what I am writing. That is what you have lived." She continued, "My novel is not really about architecture, or rather, it is not only about architecture. I have chosen architecture merely as the medium through which my theme can be expressed best. And my theme, if it can be stated briefly, could be explained perhaps in these words. The natural man, the natural way, is no longer the desirable way, etc. So she takes that paragraph from his own writing. Therefore, life is no longer really living. Okay, so you see what she's doing. She's pointing out his good personal qualities, and she is quoting from him. Now, she does tell him she doesn't intend a simple portrait. "My hero is not you. I do not intend to follow in the novel the events of your life and career. His life will not be yours, nor his work, perhaps not even his artistic ideals." Now, you notice that in the letter, she doesn't say a single word about his architectural ability, or his style, or his principles, or a single one of his buildings. Okay? She's talking only about his idealism and his integrity, and she quotes his own words as perhaps a statement of her own theme. So, what do you think he did in response? He didn't, okay? his secretary assistant, Eugene Maslink, replied that Mr. Wright was in Arizona, not Wisconsin, and would be there for several months. Her letter, though, was not answered. Not from Arizona. Letters can go to Arizona. Not from Wisconsin. Not ever. However, the letter was preserved in his papers, so it was never thrown away. Well, she continued to work. She continued to read and to take notes. She did not approve of everything she read in his writings. For example, she copied down his disparaging remarks about logic. Quote from Wright, "We are now finding that logic as a convention of human thinking will not confine within its premises art and life as creative activities," unquote. Her comment? Rubbish. Exclamation point, okay. But not everything, to be sure, was rubbish. She also copied down the following. "Let us remove everything which may disconcert daring minds and break their wings. Art is a species of valor. To deny that men of genius to come may be the peers of men of genius of the past would be to deny the overworking power of God." And then she writes, "This is given in the book in quotes, wonder from whom?" Okay. Well, she didn't know at the time, but obviously I do, and I'll tell you about that. Does anybody recognize it? Okay, well, Ayn Rand might have been able to recognize it if it had been in the original language, French. It's from a book by Victor Hugo, and the title of this book is William Shakespeare, although judging by its content, a number of readers have said that its real title should have been Moi, okay? Victor Hugo writes about Shakespeare, he's actually writing about himself. Okay, but she wrote that, she liked that, and Wright incidentally was a fan of Hugo to some extent, and she made a note of that passage. Well, a year goes by, and then comes another possible opportunity, easier. Frank Lloyd Wright was going to speak at a banquet of the National Association of Real Estate Boards on September 14th, 1938, at the Commodore Hotel in New York. Eli Jacques Kahn arranged for Ayn Rand and her husband, Frank O'Connor, to be invited. And at the event, he introduced her to Wright. She told Wright that she admired his work. She told him she was writing a novel. She asked him for an interview, and he did not refuse out of hand. So 2 months later, she tries again. And this time, she included, along with her letter, a copy of We the Living. She's not a beginner. And that was her first novel. And she also includes the first 3 chapters of the novel that became The Fountainhead. And she wrote, "The novel I'm writing is not about you, but it is the life story of a great architect who defies all traditions. I am afraid," have we ever heard Ayn Rand say I'm afraid before? But before or since, but I am afraid that the public will connect your name with it, whether you and I intend it or not. I think she was, in other words, issuing a warning. You are going to be hearing about my book. Wouldn't you like to know about it ahead of time? Okay, and she asked him for his opinion. And she said, if the work interests you, then she wants to meet. And if he disapproves, she will stop asking, but she will not abandon the project. Okay, so what do you think he did now? He was going to answer this one. His reply came just a little bit later, November 18th, and the letter she received reads, and this letter, I understand, is up there on display as part of the tour of the archives here on July 4th. Here's his letter. Dear Ayn Rand, no man named Roark with, quote, flaming red hair, unquote, that's a fake quote, could be a genius that could lick the contracting confraternity. Both items obtrude themselves disagreeably on the imagination, and he is not very convincing anyway. We'll try to sometime see you in New York and say why if you want me to do so. Well, her response was not to doubt the quality of her work, but to regard his behavior as atrocious. As she said later on, if he'd written a single why, that is, I don't like it because it's not correct architecturally, or because I don't like your individualism, or whichever it would have been, I would not have been as shocked. Here was someone whom I tried to hold as a hero in my own mind, knowing particularly that whichever I don't like about him, still this was a man of integrity who had fought an enormously difficult battle for his ideas, and he was an individualist as far as his conviction went. Now, to get a letter in that style from him was really very terrible. Now, granted, he did say that he might be willing to explain later, but after that sample of his judgment and his seriousness, you can see why it was not a preview of coming attractions. Well, what actually happened here? I don't know. I wasn't there. But Edgar Tafel was there. Edgar Tafel was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices at the time, and he remembers the incident this way, and I'm quoting him. One day while I was in the drafting room, Mr. Wright came by from his office with a manuscript, stopped at my board, and dropped it in front of me. Edgar, read this and tell me what it is about. It was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. It was about 3 inches thick, and I took it to my room. After trying to get into it, it seemed a racy, sexy, that's a dangling participle, isn't it? But okay. After, I'm quoting, okay, I didn't write it. After trying to get into it, it seemed a racy, sexy attempt into making architecture into a fashionable gossip legend with an author's message of some kind. I couldn't get past 50 pages. And with my authority as a senior apprentice, I gave it to a junior apprentice, with words to the effect that Mr. Wright wants this read and wants an opinion. The apprentice some days later said, as he handed it back, "It's a piece of junk." I gave it back to Mr. Wright and said, "Sir, it's a piece of junk." Okay, that's the way Edgar Tafel remembers it. So maybe Wright read the chapters or the opening chapter and didn't like what he read and wrote what he wrote. Or maybe he repeated an opinion that came from the senior apprentice, from the junior apprentice, and who knows whom he gave the chapters to. At best, we got third hand here, maybe. Well, after this experience, which again, Ayn Rand didn't know about Edgar Tafel's story, and all I know is that that's the way he remembered it later, but she did not try to reach him again while she was writing the full story of Howard Roark. And that story, since you've read The Fountainhead, if you know anything about Wright, you know that there are some parallels. Several readers, including people I cited on my handout, have noticed some of the parallels. Parallels between Roark's rules, as he explained them to the dean, and Wright's architectural principles, as explained in many places. And there are also resemblances between episodes in their careers. And since here I especially want to talk about what is not as well known, but I can refer you to those sources, and they mention, for example, Henry Cameron and Louis Sullivan as being embittered mentors, and Roark's Stoddard Temple and Wright's Unity Temple, and Roark's Heller House and Wright's Falling Water, and and there are more episodes like that are somewhat similar. But, and it's also true that Roark, like Wright, encountered persistent opposition from traditionalists. But Roark's full story is not Wright's story. The sharply designed contrasts in The Fountainhead were not drawn as such from Wright's life. And I'm going to give you one example. Lewis Mumford, an architectural critic, was one of Ayn Rand's stated inspirations for Ellsworth Toohey. Now, Ellsworth Toohey was Roark's key antagonist in the novel. In real life, Frank Lloyd Wright and Lewis Mumford had a 30-year correspondence. Can you imagine Howard Roark and Ellsworth Toohey writing letters to each other for 30 years? No, so it's not that's a very different kind of relationship there. Also, as she said, Ayn Rand did not portray Roark's ideas in fields outside architecture. Wright could not and would not have given Roark's trial speech, or Roark, what we call Roark's speech junior, the conversation he has with Winan about second-handedness. This is not something that Wright could have done, and he did not live Roark's life. So he was a man of integrity in his field, Ayn Rand thought, and heroic to that extent, but not the model for her ideal man. Okay, so now we go to the book. What happened next? Before the novel was published, Wright had nothing but disapproval for Ayn Rand's creation. After the book became a bestseller, things changed. He became interested in meeting the writer. And after he actually read the book, he made positive comments. Ayn Rand and Frank Lloyd Wright corresponded. She signed her letters "Reverently Yours." They met several times. She saw him in California. She saw him in New York. She visited his home in Wisconsin. He designed a house for her. That's all good stuff. And I'm going to be describing for you some features of these happy incidents. And I will also reveal a different side of the full story of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Fountainhead. So, spring of 1944, Ayn Rand is living in California, and she heard that Wright's son, Lloyd, had read her book and was saying it was based on his father. So she got in touch with him and asked if she might meet his father when Wright visited Hollywood. And it happened. The meeting took place at Lloyd's home. She remembered the conversation as a good one, that Frank Lloyd Wright listened when she expressed admiration for his buildings and explained that the novel was really about independence and integrity. And he said he wanted to read the book. She sent it. His letter of reply, which she kept in her special copy of The Fountainhead, stated that he'd read every word, that her, quote, grasp of the architectural ins and outs of a degenerate profession astonished, unquote, him, that her book showed, quote, intelligent research, unquote, that her thesis was, quote, the great one, unquote, that the individual is the fountainhead of any society worthwhile, unquote. Good stuff, right? He commented, though, that she, as he put it, sensationalized. But he did say that maybe sensationalism was what a novel was for. He also predicted that she would, quote, be set up in the marketplace and burned for a witch, unquote. And then he wrote, so far as I've unconsciously contributed anything to your material, you are welcome, unquote. Ayn Rand was very happy with this letter, and she wrote, I have taken the principle which you represent, but not the form, and I've translated it into the form of another person. I was careful not to touch upon anything personal to you as a man. I took only the essence of what constitutes a great individualist and a great artist, unquote. Now, you notice she doesn't actually say she left out bad stuff. She just says that she didn't base her Roark on him. And she responded to his point about sensationalizing her material by saying that her material is sensationalized as his buildings are, in that they are, quote, not designed for sloppy, homey living, not for flopping around in bedroom slippers, but for standing straight and making each minute count. I felt that here, one had to be a hero and lead a heroic life. She's talking about his buildings. She writes, she told him, the way that he builds. Quote, no, my characters and events are not of the century of the common man. They are not little people, nor average people, nor just like the folks next door. You don't build for the way people live, but for the way they should live. I don't write about people as they are, but as they could be and should be. As for his prediction that she would be set up in the marketplace and burned for a witch, she mentions that it's already started, that there'd been a negative review in the Architectural Forum, but she says, I can't be burned for a witch because I think I am made of asbestos. Okay. Yeah. And they say she's got no sense of humor. All right. Finally, she says that she will at some point go east to buy land for a house. And she asks if he would be willing to design one for her, and he did. And just to make that long story short, they had good correspondence back and forth about the house over the years. There was a design. He respected her as a client. She admired his ability as an architect. And as she put it, he had designed her dream house. It was magnificent, the house she hoped to have. But because she decided to live in New York, Manhattan, and not in the countryside, the design remained a vision unachieved. So that's the story of the house. You know, goodwill on both sides. He didn't want there to be a house in New York, and she didn't want to live in a house outside New York, so that's how it happened. Now, back to 1944. She noticed something about Wright's letter, that he had said certain things and he'd not said other things. She noticed they didn't say anything about his view of the character of Roark. And they had a mutual friend named Gerald Loeb, L-O-E-B, and he was a Wall Street financier who was her friend and also Wright's client. And she wrote to him and she said, I'm not even sure that he likes the story of Roark. And as far as we know, what did he think of Roark and Roark's story? Well, he had written that Roark was not very convincing, and he will say that later. And for more of his comments about the Fountainhead, stay tuned. So, where are we? we're still in 1944, and Ayn Rand is still in Hollywood, and she has prepared the final script for the Fountainhead under contract to Warner Brothers Studio, and she sends him that final script, and she asks if he would be willing to take part in making an honest picture on man's integrity and on architecture. Since I am undertaking to make the whole world conscious of great architecture, you will understand how serious I am to show truly great architecture on the screen. You know and I know that there is nobody but you who can design Roark's buildings to achieve the purpose we want the picture to achieve. She had, in fact, written the script to showcase his work. As she later recalled, one of the reasons why we have that montage showing the transition of times through his drawing, that was devised by me to stop the show and to be an art gallery show for Frank Lloyd Wright. That was for him and no one else. No one else could have filled it. Whether he realized that or not, then or later, I will never know. So what did he think when he looked at the script? He said, all right, the script does not betray you, but he did not agree to take part in the film. Well, she didn't take no for a final answer, and neither did her friend Gerald Loeb. Gerald Loeb was an admirer of the Fountainhead, and he really wanted to make the match here. Gerald Loeb was very busy, wrote a lot of letters, and he was really trying to make the connection between Ayn Rand, Frank Lloyd Wright, Henry Blanke, who was the designated producer, and the studio. So, May of 1945, Loeb wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright that this would be a chance to reach millions of people and to teach them about architecture. He pointed out how many people are going to read your books. How many people are going to see the movie? Okay, and, well, that didn't quite work. He didn't say yes. Wright did keep in touch with Ayn Rand, and in the fall of 1945, she was invited to a news conference at the Plaza Hotel in New York, at which Wright unveiled the model for the Guggenheim Museum. At about the same time, Gerald Loeb hosted a dinner for Ayn Rand and her husband and Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife. I wish I could have been there, okay? Because I'll tell you the way she remembers it. On this occasion, she tried to persuade him to do the sets for the Fountainhead, and she thought that she had persuaded him. And here's from her letter to Henry Blanke, the producer. Well, I got Frank Lloyd Wright for you. I had dinner with Mr. Wright here and brought him to change his attitude on the question of doing the buildings for the Fountainhead. He will do them on the following conditions. The price he asks is $250,000. Point 2. He wants a guarantee that the buildings, drawings, or miniatures he designs will be executed and used in the picture exactly as he designed them without any change whatsoever. And she made the point that this was his own idea. It was not her idea. Okay. 3, he wants a guarantee that the final script used in actual production will not depart basically from the vision he has read. 4, he will undertake to have all of the models and miniatures made by his fellowship in his own workshop at Taliesin for actual use in the picture. If you want him to, he will design not only Roark's buildings, but also the other sets and all the examples of bad architecture. So you're going to get really authentic bad architecture here, okay? All right. So she added, needless to say, I'm delighted at the possibility of having FLW for the picture. It would give us an artistic prestige which no other picture has ever equaled. A picture with original Wright buildings would be a permanent classic in the history of art. There will be no question raised anywhere by anyone as to whether the buildings are good or bad architecture, and we are justified as presenting them as the work of a genius. They will be the actual work of a genius. Mr. Wright has invited me to stay at Taliesin on my way back to the coast. All right, well, this sounds pretty cheerful, right? From her letter, one would assume that Frank Lloyd Wright was all set, ready to do the work, and that only the Warner Brothers could stand in the way. In other words, he was ready to have his buildings up there as the work of Howard Roark. Well, the visit to Taliesin did happen. Ayn Rand and her husband spent several days at Taliesin. She found Taliesin to be magnificent, and she was, as she told her niece, more crazy than ever about his architecture. But the full story includes more than architecture. During their visit, Wright criticized Roark, as Ayn Rand remembers it, for the incapacity to regard himself as a fool, and for lacking not only a sense of humor, but also a community similar to the Taliesin Fellowship. And then there was Olga Vanna, Frank Lloyd's wife, who objected to the novel because Dominique harms Roark's career. No loving partner would ever do such a thing. So that was her objection, was that she couldn't imagine herself as Dominique. And then there was the episode of the Fireplace. As Donald Hoppin tells the story, when Ayn Rand arrived at Taliesin, Wright sent a message asking her to wait for him in the living room. So she stood by the fireplace and waited. Meanwhile, Wright called up Ed, the old Welsh stonemason who was more than 70, and told him that the fireplace had a loose stone that needed fixing. Okay, old Ed went into the living room and, finding only Ayn Rand there, asked her what exactly needed fixing in the fireplace, unquote. Well, it is reasonable to assume that Ayn Rand was not exactly amused by this parody of an episode from the Fountainhead. Okay, but she still, of course, wanted Wright to participate in the making of the film. So after the visit, she set up a meeting with Henry Blanke, the film's producer, and her friend Gerald Loeb wrote to Jack and Harry Warner, the heads of the studio. Jack Warner said, "They're not quite ready to go ahead with the film, hang in there." A year later, hanging in there, Warner Brothers had still done nothing. Ayn Rand wrote to Henry Blanke. She pointed out that an article in Life magazine had assumed that Wright was the model for Roark, and she said, people will be disappointed if he's not connected with the film. And still, Warner Brothers did nothing. Nothing in 1946, nothing in 1947, delays and delays. And, I kind of going through the paperwork, and it's like, I know how the story comes out, but I'm still watching and seeing all these false starts. There was a time when Frank Lloyd Wright, prompted by Loeb, invited King Vidor, who was the director, and Henry Blanke, the producer, to Taliesin West with plans for a screening of Blanke's latest film, which was The Treasure of Sierra Madre. And there's all this correspondence and what size is your projector and what size is the film and when you're coming and specific plans, telegrams. Nothing happened. They got sort of close to a meeting, nothing happened. Gerald Loeb continued to try to exercise his good offices to persuade Wright to remain willing while trying to persuade those Warner Brothers to sign on the dotted line. Well, I kept looking at all of this maze of missed signals. I went over to the Warner Brothers, studio papers, looked at Frank Lloyd Wright's papers, looked at Ayn Rand's papers, and I noticed that some of the drama, much of the drama, is undocumented, as if decisions were being made without a tangible record. And Ayn Rand herself said that she didn't know at the time or at any time who was responsible. She thought that Blanke favored the hiring of Wright and that Vidor and the Warners did not care. But she didn't know what the sequence was or what was happening. No one seemed to be telling her. No one was writing to her and not explaining. In 1948, the film was again underway. And as late as the second half of May 1948, with the shooting of the film scheduled to start in July, Henry Blanke, the producer, was writing in a letter to Loeb that hiring Frank Lloyd Wright to design the sets was still a possibility. Blanke told Loeb that the final pages of the script were being rewritten, that he and Vidor were still working on the budget, that they expected to be asking Warner Brothers soon, and that they wanted to involve Loeb in the negotiations with Wright. So hope was still alive. But on May 24th, 1948, Frank Lloyd Wright wrote a letter that insulted everybody in multiple ways. And I'm going to quote from this letter. I infer that my services in connection with the production of a screen version of the Rand novel The Fountainhead might be considered at a price. As for architecture, how would Hollywood know it if they saw it, even if it were to see it as a background for rape? The Rand hero was her least convincing character, and when she tried to make his match in womanhood, it was just too difficult, and she succeeded in making only a bitch. Her thesis, of course, I respect. Your picture might open the eyes of people to what a living architecture would do for them were they to conceive it, but not as glamorized hero worship or sex-coded pill. And he says that any Hollywood film would have to require the sacrifice of integrity. Well interpreted, The Fountainhead might pack a mighty wallop, but it won't, and I understand why it can't. Therefore, I dismiss it. All this I have told the insistent Loeb and the prayerful Ayn Rand. What I now say here directly to you may save your valuable time and myself from further embarrassment. He had not said these things to Ayn Rand or to Gerald Loeb, not in writing, not in any way that we know about. And yet he was now telling the film's producer that he was never, ever, ever, ever going to design the sets for the Warner Brothers film of The Fountainhead. Well, in late June 1948, Loeb found out what Wright had done, and he was not pleased. I think it's a great mistake on your part to have turned down this opportunity to do something to help architecture that 32 million people would have seen. And I think it's a great mistake, too, on your part to turn down the money that you might have realized from it and spent for the benefit of the fellowship. Wright replied, I could not believe that there was anything there to work with, and not for any sum would I lower my standard for theirs, which I would have to do if I took their money. I am chiefly sorry for Ayn Rand, who will come out of the whole fracas, if at all, badly treated. Well, Ayn Rand wrote to Loeb, I tried to fight for Mr. Wright in every way I could, but as you know, the decision was not up to me. I do not know all the details of what has happened, but I am very sorry that this is the way it has turned out. As for the designs made for the film by someone who had never actually built anything, Ayn Rand later commented, Blanky knew enough to know they were pretty bad, and he took my advice on one issue. I told him that since they are so awful, hold them on the screen just long enough to show it's a modern building and cut it off before people can see the details, which he did. Of course, what did she know about DVDs and pause and stills? Okay, but anyway, that was her view. Meanwhile, the film went ahead. And here's a letter from Frank Lloyd Wright's son that he wrote to him that August. It was fortunate that you were not drawn into the Ayn Rand mess. Okay, let's see, Ayn Rand, A-N-N-E. I met the producer of her show last week, and he unburdened himself. I guess that'd be Blanky. He said Rand's lines for the picture are unbelievably corny. That she, with the director, was subverting every principle her novel was supposed to support. And he was amused at the about-face the director made, who'd been claiming with tears in his eyes that only Frank Lloyd Wright could possibly do the picture. And the son said, this is a complete travesty. Well, from that letter, it looks as if Blanky, the producer, was going around disparaging the script, and as if Vidor, the director, may have lacked courage to commit to his values. But then again, this comes from someone who might not be the most reliable source, maybe told his father what his father wanted to hear, but did regard the film as a betrayal and thought that Ayn Rand was part of that shameful process. And then it got a little worse, okay? Even before the film was released, George Nelson wrote an article attacking the designs. It was published in Interiors. When Frank Lloyd Wright was invited to comment, he did not choose to defend the novel or Ayn Rand or the script. Instead, he simply refused to comment publicly. He wrote to the editor of the publication, any move I would make against such grossly abusive caricature of my work by this film crew would only serve their purpose. They belie the one decent thesis of the Fountainhead, the inalienable right of the individual to the integrity of his work. It is best to laugh. Well, that's not just, okay? It's not just to impute to the film crew the purpose of caricaturing his work. So, what have we got so far? He's willing to be nasty about the novel's characters and about the film and the filmmakers, and to do it more than once. Okay, now we come to the questions that he got over the years when people wrote to him and said, is Howard Roark really you? Here's his response to Mrs. Leo Koretsky, who wrote to him in 46 because she noticed a similarity between Roark and Wright. He replied, Ayn Rand says she modeled her hero on my career. But inasmuch as I was unwilling to pose, she took pains to camouflage the personality of the hero. Now that's not true, and he knew it wasn't true. She didn't model him. Roark on him, and she certainly didn't camouflage the hero's personality. The questions persisted, and sometimes he didn't bother to reply. Sometimes he had a secretary reply. In 1949, his secretary replied to one questioner as follows. Ayn Rand, author of The Fountainhead, took all the ideas concerning architecture from Mr. Wright's own writing on the subject and principles of architecture, which he has practiced for many years. But that is where the semblance ends, and that is why Mr. Wright refused to have anything to do with either the book or the movie production. Well, that's misleading, too, about his refusal to participate. And then there was another interview in 1955 where he's quoted in the following exchange. Weren't you depicted as Roark, the architect hero of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, later made into a movie? Wright smiled at the memory. Yes, Ayn Rand wanted to come to Wisconsin for a year to watch me at work. I refused. I would not sit in life for her portrait. But she sent me the first chapters of the work and the first pages of the finished novel. Now, on her copy of this magazine, Ayn Rand marks this with an arrow and writes, not true. Okay, because it isn't true. Now, these comments are comparatively innocuous, although Wright does take pains to distance himself from her and from her novel. But then there's this. This is a comment he made in an interview at the time of the film's release. He is reported to have said, I agree with the Fountainhead's thesis, the right of an artist to his work, but I think she bungled it. It's a treacherous slant on my philosophy. He also says, she asked me to endorse the book, but I refused. Now, in case you think he may have been misunderstood or misquoted, here are his comments in Biloxi, which were preserved on tape. So this is what he said in the Q&A. Question. Ever since reading the book, I've wanted to hear Mr. Wright on the subject of that great piece of American literature that Miss Ayn Rand wrote, The Fountainhead. Answer. Well, that's very simple, and it's easily disposed of. I'm sure of this because I haven't seen the movie, which is forthcoming. Miss Ayn Rand has apparently played house with the idea which I've just expressed to you here tonight of the individual as such. She has absolutely mistaken and abused the privilege which she took to herself and is going to get people very mixed up if they're already in the gutter. But I don't think this is going to hurt anybody who isn't in the gutter already. So I don't think you or I need worry much about it. I suspect it's a hideous deformation from any standpoint of a great philosophy. Well, he had praised the book. He told her, and even Blanky, that he agreed with the thesis. He'd even said it was great. And in front of someone who asks him about that great work of literature, he mocked, belittled, and attacked the writer. Okay? He makes it appear that Ayn Rand is in effect a second-hander and to disparage her work and her character. And yes, I love his buildings, but I'm still angry. Okay? This is not okay. Now, Ayn Rand herself, she handled things differently. She told the truth. Aren't some of the, when she was asked, about the characters, she said, there's no similarity between Roark and Mr. Wright as far as personal life, character, and basic philosophy are concerned. The only parallel which may be drawn is purely architectural. You notice that she says that they're different, but she doesn't disparage Roark. She just says they're different. And if you look at her comments while she was writing Atlas Shrugged and at some of the comments she made in a biographical interview years later, she did have some negative things to say about him, but she didn't make these public. So, where are we in the end? The Fountainhead, according to Ayn Rand, is not fundamentally about architecture, about integrity and independence and individualism. According to both the novelist and the architect, her hero is not really Frank Lloyd Wright. They agree with each other, and I agree with them. Okay? Because, as someone once said in a different context, I've read about Howard Roark. I know Howard Roark. Howard Roark is a hero of mine. And Frank Lloyd Wright, you are no Howard Roark. Okay. So, one more time, for the record, Ayn Rand says, please note for the record, he is not the prototype of Roark, nor is his philosophy Roark's, nor his biography, only the basic architectural principle and the fact that he was an innovator fighting for modern architecture against tradition. So, if Frank Lloyd Wright is not Howard Roark, who is? Well, here's what she said. Readers have asked me whether there's a real prototype of Howard Roark. Literally no, essentially yes. Every man, who has an innate sense of independence and self-respect and a spark of the creative mind, has that much of Roark in him, end quote. So who is Howard Roark, the real Howard Roark? You are at your human best, and you have then that much of Roark in you. That's the first answer. Second answer comes from her original dedication to the novel, which was to Frank O'Connor, and she wrote, "To Frank O'Connor, who is less guilty of second-handedness than anyone I know." And she changed the title to The Fountainhead, and she changed the dedication just to Frank O'Connor. So that's the second answer. And the third answer, I think, is pretty obvious. An example of sterling integrity, unborrowed vision, unbreached independence, and the creative mind in full flame. Well, we know who that is. Roark's soul, the novel makes clear, is in his work, in his buildings. And Ayn Rand's work is her writing and what she built. The real Howard Roark, what she built, was the Fountainhead. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, questions?
Thank you for that very interesting talk. I want to add a few things that I heard from her. One is that when she went to Taliesin, you probably know this, he had set himself up as the aristocrat and the other people as serfs, and they had to sit at a low table while he sat at a high table to eat, and the whole thing was feudal, she thought, and she was turned off by that. Did you also find that in the...
Yeah, well, what you've got here is an 18-page version of the 50 pages I wrote. So, yeah, I know about that. But and she had other things to say about the way that the serfs treated him, and how they were conformist and so on. So she had a very good impression of the architecture. She had not a very good impression of him and the relationship with the apprentices. And we're not even going to talk about Olgavana. But I'm not surprised that she remembered that clearly, and that in Justice, that's part of the full story, that she had that as a bad impression of Taliesin. That's true.
She also thought he was a second-hander in his personal life, and didn't he say something positive about Russia, or he went to Russia to be honored?
Yes, that's why I said that if you're going to read the autobiography, read the 1932, because in the later edition, he writes about Russia and his good impressions of it, and she said, if I had seen that, I would still have liked his architecture, but I wouldn't have tried to talk to him. And as far as the second-handedness, I think that she did say that in his soul, not so much of a Roark, maybe a different character in the Fountainhead.
And if I may, you had a verbal slip where you said she didn't, near the end, you said she didn't disparage Roark.
Oh,
and you meant she didn't disparage
Wright. Didn't disparage Wright, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you for a lovely talk. I didn't quite catch the name, but as part of her research, she worked for an architect?
Yes, Kahn is his last name, and E.J. Kahn, E is for Eli, and J is for Jacques.
What was the connection between him and Wright, in terms of architectural style?
Interesting. Yeah, well, he was obviously not as successful as Roark, but he was, a successful New York architect. He had some positive things to say about Wright's architecture, which he admired, and he had questions about Wright's relationship with his clients and his handling of the business. So, but he knew him enough that Frank Lloyd Wright sent him some principles that came from something that he'd written and autographed that to him. So, he didn't just know him as someone from the newspapers or someone whose books and buildings he knew, but something of a personal relationship. But, and he knew also that she was writing, Kahn knew Ayn Rand was writing about architecture, but he was evidently somewhat, surprised by the way the book turned out. I don't think unhappy, but she didn't think it was proper to acknowledge him directly in the sense of to him, but she did, is if you look in the book, you'll see she acknowledges all the architects together, and part of that is a way of saying thanks. Yeah, thanks for letting me work there.
Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to your article. As you were speaking, I was reminded of my own studies of architecture in the past, and I could never see I couldn't see this Frank Lloyd Wright, Howard Roark. Frank Lloyd Wright left his wife and 6 children. Frank Lloyd Wright married or had an affair with the wife of a client, and then absconded to Europe. Mm-hmm. She was killed in a horrible fire in their home, and after that, I believe he engaged in seances. So again, I just never saw this. I saw this.
Well, that's because the lives aren't the same. Incidentally, by the way, there is a novel that is really about it's a roman à clef about him. It's by the writer Meyer Levin, and
Yes.
It's called The Architect. So, people who kind of want that in a fictionalized form, but of course the stories are quite different.
Divergent,
Yeah,
at
quite
least.
divergent.
A quick question. Louis Sullivan
Yes.
was someone who was a great architect and who was the one who coined the form follows function.
Yes.
In your studies and in your research, what did you find in her comments about Louis Sullivan and how that might have influenced?
Okay, well that's interesting. That was she knew something about Sullivan very earlier in her research, and of course he was featured in Wright's autobiography. But it looks as if she had other information that she didn't write down exactly where it came from. The notes that she took on Sullivan, I think the published version of the Journals of Ayn Rand has got that pretty accurately without a lot of things left out, which happens elsewhere. So if you look in that book, there were some comments that she made about Sullivan there.
Great.
But,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, but that was from early in her research.
Thank you for your tremendous research. My question is, why, I believe that Rand did admire other architects. Was there any reason, or was it just a fall through that they didn't find another architect to design the sets in the movie?
Oh, okay. So the question has to do with the Hollywood movie and why they ended up the way they ended up. Ayn Rand actually had some other ideas, but this wasn't including Neutra, who had built the house she bought in Hollywood. She was living in a Neutra house. And so, why couldn't Neutra do it? But that wasn't within her control, and there were money issues. And besides that, I think that she really wanted it to be right. And she pushed for that, and to start pushing for other people before it was firmly no wouldn't make sense. I mean, that's sort of like saying, well, the backup plan is whatever. So I think that she had it in her mind that somebody, there could be someone who would be better than the way it ended up, but she didn't push for that the way that she pushed for right. Okay, somebody just sat down. Oh, you're saying I got to cut it? Yep. Okay, then I will say, can I say one thing? He sent her a book, Frank Lloyd Wright did, and he wrote in it, for Ayn Rand, who seems so much more successful than with fiction than I am with fact. And she wrote, that's nice, right? And she wrote back to him, as for your inscription, I would like to say that I've never known any facts as magnificently successful as Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. Buildings. So, if I succeeded with fiction, it was in great measure because these facts helped me to believe in man's creative faculty. So I think we can end their interchange on those happy terms. Yeah. Thank you.